at 6:30. So first of all, welcome all, and I should just welcome all, don't swallow that phrase, welcome all. I just want to, before we begin, I must do the acknowledgements of country, most importantly. Bidiagal, Birigal, and the Gadigal people of traditionally lived along this coast, and would like to acknowledge the privilege of doing work on their traditional lands. So that is great. Also would like to acknowledge the Waverley Council, who very generously provided me, and also the Local Creative Collaborators program. It's a passion of mine to have, I used to be a scientist, and I'm now, I practice as an artist, in that space in between, whatever that space might be. And I really believe in the importance of artists and science, like art and science getting to know each other. Now, of course, art and science can't get to know each other, but artists and scientists can. And previously I have had encounters with artists and scientists, and I call them encounters because they're interesting things, because we come from such different cultures, that to find that common ground is really quite an interesting thing. And there's a beautiful idea coming from Aboriginal sort of mythology, let's not call it mythology, cultural expression, called weaving knowledge. So I think my paradigm has always been, well, how does art fit into science? Because science is very logical, and you've got to find the ways that they sort of should follow a rational kind of approach. And art is somehow not quite that, although I guess it can be that. But weaving knowledge talks more about just ideas encountering each other and sort of interacting with each other in a less like, oh, this must be right kind of way, which is just, it's a narrative-based approach to the way things can interact. And I thought it's a beautiful way to have a conversation rather than saying, well, science is right or art. Let's just see how they can talk to each other in a gentle sort of way. So that brings me then to this evening, where I'm extremely excited by the panelists I have here. I should just, full disclosure, we are in a journal club together. I've learned a tremendous about what art is to these wonderful people here. So I have on Jane Burton-Taylor on my far left over there, and next to Annalise Young, both practicing artists, very interesting artists. And I came about, I've known Annalise, your work for a while, but there was one exhibition in particular which I thought really talked to science. For me, I had a bit of an epiphany at your exhibition, where you, in my eyes, both of us, yes, both of you.
Collaborators.
Yes, collaborators, thank you. And please feel free to correct me as you go along. And the same is true for members of the audience. This should be very, very casual, okay, because this is what it is. So yes, you had this beautiful exhibition a couple of years ago called Tethered, where it felt to me like what you'd done was have the impression of nature very delicately and gently brought into the gallery space. In a way that seemed to me like it was asking questions about nature, our relationship to nature, but in a very different way to what I typically understand about how scientists might do it. Now, we've all been to the museums where we go and we have the drawers full of dead birds and things with pins stuck in them. So there's this other way that we have studied, certainly in the Western situation. We remove things from nature, we stick a pin in it, and then we try and see, well, how does this thing work? Which doesn't work very well when there's a pin in it. And I think what your work is all about that relationship, and that is a profound thing. So I'm very excited that you can be here tonight, and you should just enjoy it. And then on my right, I have Professor Russell Bonjuriansky. We've shared a panel before, and I love Russell's, his insights. He's very curious about not just science, but the way, importantly, it is in society and how it affects society and how society perceives it. So I'll just quickly say what I think your work is about. So Russell is interested in, I must preface that by saying that I was in a similar scientific field to Russell, where the gene, looking at evolutionary biology, where the gene is the prime suspect or the main thing that determines what the organism is. All right, it's really this organizing principle of evolutionary biology. And that was really how I understood it and worked in it for many years. When I encountered Russell and his work, he looks at it a bit more, I would say, I think the word holistic, is that a word we use? But it's quite holistic. You look at how non-genetic things might also influence evolution, which is probably hard to study, I would guess. And actually, what's really interesting for me about that is that, it's not atomistic. The whole scientific tradition has always been, you can study the atom and how it behaves, the atom, and we discover DNA. DNA is like the atom of biology, and if we just know that, we will know biology, we'll know how things work. And then realizing that, well, actually, again, it's about we've removed it from nature and we can't really know it as well. So that is an introduction, and I think what I will do now is I'll just go straight into asking a question. Let's have a conversation, and if there's anything from the audience, please feel free to participate. So, or if you wouldn't mind, there's actually the way I'd like to start this. These are my notes. So yeah. Actually, let's talk about this. Why not start here? The idea of truth. All right. Now scientists, truth-seeking. First of all, truth is a value. All right. Truth is a value that we value. Right. Doesn't mean that it's necessarily some fundamentally important thing, but we value it in our culture. Now, I'd love to actually start maybe with Annalise or Jake. Well, let's say Annalise. Does the word truth have any resonance in your work as an artist? And you can please join in, Jake.
I think generally yes, but it's not a generalized truth. It's about, for me anyway, it's about delivering authenticity to your approach and integrity to making work. Mm-hmm. So within that, it's not about what you know, but it's about or delivering a definitive truth. But it's much more about the integrity under which the work is taken, so that there's an authenticity within the processes that you undertake, and within kind of an embracing of your curiosity, so you're not doing the work for someone else. You're doing the work from your own position, question, and hopefully some kind of understanding. That's kind of what it means to me.
And that from yourself
is
maybe a good way to pivot to Russell, because what you're saying, I think, is that the authenticity, the truth, is from the self. Whereas in science, what would you say, how it truths with the science and as a general?
So I think one way to look at it that kind of relates to what Emily said is that in science, at least in fundamental science, the kind of science that I do, we follow our curiosity. So if I'm doing genuine research and I'm studying what I'm genuinely interested in, I'm genuinely curious about. And I guess there's another aspect to a kind of truth or authenticity in that I'm expected to report what I genuinely observe rather than what I imagine or what I invent or whatever. Unless it's theory, of course, which I invent. But if it's empirical science, I'm expected to report what I see or what I can measure with my measuring instruments. That makes sense.
Yeah, so there's a more of a, almost like a rigor in terms of process to science.
Yeah.
I was going to mention earlier the idea of truth to process, because there's an expression in art school, truth to process, where you're honest about the way you're using materials. You don't put affectations on it, and I think both of us are pretty serious about that, both in our individual practices and when we work together. But we're sort of free of having that rigor that science has to define, that science defines truth through. That's a big difference.
We don't have to prove it. We can kind of come to an experiential idea of through what, that channel of curiosity that then takes you down, leads you towards something. But it doesn't have to be repeatable, and it doesn't have to be. It's not challenged in the same way. It gets changed. It will get challenged on other criteria.
But doesn't it
Conceptually.
capture something that other people can relate to and recognize as art?
Well,
Well, that's a good question.
that's a good question, but I think it's impossible to create that. I think I teach at the National Arts School, and one thing I think that I see is people get into trouble when they think they're making work for someone else, because you end up second guessing yourself, and then you lose that self-truth. And I think that in that quite possibly is a fundamental difference. That you hope that someone gets what you're doing. Not everyone's going to get it. I mean, that's inevitable with art. It's too subjective in the way that it's read by people. So I think if you second guess yourself, you kind of get into all kinds of trouble because you can't make it work.
And what kind of dialogue with that kind of approach to material could you have with a scientific knowledge, or would you want to have the dialogue with the scientific knowledge, or the scientific process, or the scientific material? I've actually got if I may just borrow, there's a slide I just want you to go to, because it might be a good place to go. Go to near the top.
Yep.
Oh, I was going to show that slide, but we'll get to that later. Go down. Go down. Yes. So that's a photograph of Marie Curie in her lab, and there's all those materials.
Which happens.
Yeah, isn't it just?
Yeah.
So if you as an artist, would you be captured by the material that you're seeing, or is it the idea that's coming from? There, on the right, we have Einstein. Who's, the idea. It's there's no material. There's just this pristine idea.
Both, yeah. And I would
That's too easy.
I would jump in and say that I traditionally, well, for me, I'm more conceptually based. So I'll often start with an idea, and then I'll look for an object to work with or a material to work with. Whereas I would say you're more process based, although not that you don't have a concept, but
Yeah, I have an overriding. I think I have an overriding conceptual base, which isn't particular, and I can fall down a rabbit hole of materiality quite easily. But then, sort of, so in a sense, process is like process with materiality in art is often about exploring its limitations and your limitations with it, and what you might get out of it. It's interesting because I'm completely I've always been very fascinated by ideas around science, even though I don't pretend to understand everything, but I'm kind of enamored of the ability of that kind of thinking, because that to me is the most creative thinking at that level.
Well, that actually takes me to an idea coming from your work. Or will you just go down one or two slides there? Stop there. Okay. So that. First of all, forgive me for just cutting and pasting your Instagram page.
Yeah.
But I remember we were having a conversation about those drawings of yours, those graphite drawings.
Yes.
And I said to you they reminded me of platonic solids.
Yes.
And the idea that Plato was all about the idea that he saw, I think, reality as a few universal shapes. Now your shapes are not universal.
No.
So how does that then relate to? First of all, am I right in thinking that somehow they are platonic solids? And how did you arrive at that kind of expression?
Well, I guess at the level that they're measured, they derive from the measurement of real space, and which is then.
Can you talk about that you're measuring real space?
Well, those particular drawings are from. They're based on an original intervention that I did, because a lot of what I do is ephemeral intervention, which is putting objects or doing artwork in a particular space, and you do it and you pull it down, and it doesn't exist anymore. So so part of the documentation is to record that on XY coordinates, and then I measure that out, and then I make connections between objects that might be similar, which project in a shape, which then becomes a form, and that's kind of how they're derived. So in a sense, they're not dissimilar to the idea of a platonic solid, which is a way of explaining the realities of, you know, the space, unit space, but they're kind of particular to a particular situation in a particular time, and then they get extrapolated and become many different things.
Right.
So kind of combining the personal, highly personal and experiential and memory and science.
Yeah.
So it really just does boil down to that yours is, I mean, it seems, it's intensely personal.
Yeah.
I might relate to that.
Yeah.
But I mean, Russell, intensely personal seems to also be how you relate to your work. Do you see it as a personal expression of who you are? And
Sure.
it made you go down
Yeah, because actually the path of getting to discovering for myself and for many scientists, discovering what you're interested in and what you enjoy doing and what kind of things you're good at, what kind of things you can use kind of tools, what kind of ideas you can use to make discoveries, and there's also a very personal idiosyncratic process in that sense.
What took you to wanting to study evolutionary biology? I mean, that's what is that fundamental thing that happened in your life? I know what happened with me, but only after the fact. But I'm very curious to know why you wanted to study how things evolve.
I have no idea.
Okay. Well, that is
When I was 5 years old or something, I became very interested in insects. I thought I wanted to study these things, but I had no idea what that meant. My parents tried to talk me out of it. But then somehow I discovered that I was very interested in looking at things from an evolutionary perspective and using insects to try to get at those things because they're easy to breed in the lab. There are a lot of them. They're really different and diverse.
Can you make generalized, so your work, do you feel like, because I think part of what you're trying to do as an artist, I think, well, it's nice when it happens, you get some universal statement about how you feel the world is. And I think, Jane, yours often about, in your artist statement, you, what's the word? You used a really good word, of course I don't have it here, but I'd say you're underpinned by, you're an activist, you want to see change in the world.
Yes. I think my work's quite political often.
Yeah. So I guess what I was trying to get at was, I'm actually not really sure what I was trying to get at. But
I was going to say insects are his materiality really, in a way.
Yeah.
And then it's, I don't know, but with materiality, there's always a way that the material informs your work. So there's a relationship back and forth. It's not like you go, I'm going to do a drawing. I mean, no, I don't think we're that kind of artist, but I'm going to do a drawing and this is what I know a pencil will do. The pencil starts to inform you about all the things it can do. And for me, I often choose an object, to work with an object, a historical existing object. And then I interfere with the object, and through working on the object, I make, like with the maps, I make a statement, or I try to make a statement, or I make art.
Right.
So often with an existing field.
And would you have chosen insects because they're easy to get a handle on, or because they actually can tell you something universal about the way the world, the way things are?
Wonderful things in biology and science in general. I think everything's connected. You can start anywhere and you get to anywhere going through all kinds of connections. For me, the materiality was the animals, but also science has done in a very different way. The kind of science I do combines being out in the field, so out in the forest, very natural kind of settings, but also bringing things into the lab and doing experiments with microscopes and all kinds of equipment.
Yeah, and it's also that idea of they completely diametrically opposed. The idea of going into the world.
Yeah.
It's kind of what you do.
Yes,
Anyway.
yes,
Many
definitely.
of your work is about going into the world and seeing what you can extract back. So it feels like there's some kind of relationship there
There is,
between
definitely.
the world and then how you abstract it.
Absolutely.
And not just abstract it, because you're definitely also then questioning it with the materials that you've got back. And you're doing exactly the same, right? Is that fair to say?
I think it's fair to say, but I also think there's a connection that when you were mentioning you work with ephemeral things,
Yes.
in a way that reminds me of the fact that in biology, at least in evolutionary ecology, we work with such incredible diversity. Every species is unique, every genotype is unique, every individual is unique. It's very difficult to generalize. We don't know how to generalize it. So we study a particular thing and we try to extract some kind of meaning from it, but it's different from everything else. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess, well, I mean, you're not interested in generalizing, is that fair to say? Well, when there's a pause, it also is a way, it's actually the panelist way of inviting.
I said a fight.
Oh, a fight?
Oh, no, I don't think there's a
No,
fight.
no, no.
No, I don't think there's a fight, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, maybe the
I'm
question is a
not-
bit vague.
I'm not sure.
You know what?
I think often the things we do are open-ended in a sense,
Yes.
and certainly the collaborative things we've done, we work a lot on. We called our exhibition Tethered because we thought there's this relationship with nature. You know, we often see ourselves as separate from nature or the natural world, but we're tethered to it. So everything that happens to the natural world is going to happen to us as we are all experiencing our climate change. But yeah.
Do you feel disconnected from nature?
No, I don't, but I think part of how the world, my belief is that part of how we've come to this pass, basically, of having melting ice caps and, huge problems in the way we treat animals and the biodiversity crashing all over the place. We've trashed the planet a little bit, and so I guess we discussed a lot with Tethered. And one of the things we felt was that there was a disconnect between human beings and the natural world. And that, I suppose that is a generalisation, but we were exploring that and thinking about that and trying to sensitise ourselves to the natural world in the process of our research, and then bringing things back into the gallery where people could, we recorded birds and we dyed with indigenous plants, which was just kind of surprisingly beautiful because the colours were just incredible that the indigenous plants came back with. So there was just an exploration, I guess. And we were encouraging, I guess, we hoped people who came to the exhibition would also be a little bit surprised and engaged maybe in a way they hadn't been before with the indigenous environment.
Maybe it's rekindling a relationship.
Yes.
Rekindling,
I think that,
sure.
yeah, sure. That's a
And
great
actually what it
word
did for me,
yeah.
there was because I think in science we privilege the eye, we privilege the visual, and I think I know in the 1700s. In fact, Professor Paul Thomas he gave me a paper many years ago called "The Death of the Sensuous Chemist," and it was all about how chemists used to use their senses, their nose,
Yeah.
So we don't do that anymore because we've got instruments for that. Oh, well, here we go. So,
Excellent.
Okay. But well, then it's kind of you've muted my point. Actually, you've undermined my point. I was going to make. That's okay. I love the way. Anyway, so that's amazing. I'd love to hear more about that. But I love the way you did privilege the olfactory, or made us see nature differently as a way of systematizing, which I think you've done. So that's amazing.
I tried to do that through
Yeah.
sight, sound, touch.
Right.
Someone in the audience.
I know.
I love this. It's so interesting the parallels between the two. Just wondering with science, where you're doing your investigation with it to prove it's through a hypothesis. I was wondering if you had a similar agenda in art and whether you actually walk away saying proving or disproving the concept.
Certainly academically,
Yes.
our master's and PhD system is based on the scientific system, so we have to, if we're doing a master's or PhD, we have to come up with a question that we will try and prove. So certainly, academically, we've followed in the footsteps of science. I probably don't do that enough in my work. Sorry?
Can you prove aesthetics?
No, this might be something like, I'm just trying to think what my Yeah, well, they make you come up with a question. You've got to come up with a question for your masters. I can't actually remember what mine was.
And somehow the work that you produce, when you do a Masters of Fine Arts, you're producing basically an exhibition, and you're writing an exegesis or a paper, and the paper is generally, when you're examined, the paper's read first, and it's somehow all the things that you're trying to explore or hone in on the paper needs to somehow be present in your work. So I guess what it does is it develops your own critical thinking around what you do, so that you actually start to, instead of thinking, oh, I like that, you start to think, how does that function as a piece of art, I guess? How can it be read, So you're making those decisions about your own work.
But outside of academia, when putting on an exhibition, and you're thinking about an idea, is it just exploring variations of the idea, or is it that you want to test something through your art and come to a conclusion?
Such a great question. I don't think I do that so much in my art. I don't think I do it.
I think we explore what we feel driven to explore, and then in terms of the critique, that comes down to, is what I'm doing actually performing the way I think it needs to perform to impart that sensibility, and I get, so you become critical about what you do, and things get.
It's like a conversation with the public as well. Like we recently had a big installation in North Sydney. When I say big, it just was a very technical one. It was large physically as well, in North Sydney Art Prize, and we went and sat it for a couple of days because it was in a sort of, it had a whole room of its own, and the conversations that happened with the public were just so fantastic, really. Just people when I'm talking about the work and talking about the ideas in the work, and and I think in a sense we did feel that we were successful in communicating what we wanted to communicate, which was gratifying, although some people definitely went through with their iPhones and did
I mean, you've got the attention span of what's the flipping on Instagram now, 3 seconds, so art's got a really hard job.
Yeah, just got a question for us all. So, when you've had the greatest successes testing a hypothesis, is it because you've had more success in executing the experiment, like the analytical side, or in the creative side, like coming up with a hypothesis and the idea? Is it, I know it's probably the answer both, but is there any kind of ways you find it's?
Yeah, I think it's both, and there are different ways, different kinds of science, different ways to do science. But one of the most important critical steps is being able to come up with a new question, actually. And so once the question is there, it's almost, I shouldn't say trivial, but a lot of the work is done. So it's just a matter of coming up with a good way to kind of try to answer that question. But without a good question, you're just stuck with just things around you, just a world in the way. So the question is really critical, but then also, once you have the question, how do you answer it? And so there's also a process there, coming up with a system to answer it. And there's a lot of work, a lot of materials, a lot of equipment, process.
What's your big question?
We're going to, I guess, a few big questions. Well, one big question is one that Steve mentioned, which is how do non-genetic factors that are transmitted from parents to offspring and parents across generations generally influence evolution. So the things that are transmitted in parallel genes. So these are the kind of things in that broad category, things like if parents eat junk food or they smoke, that has an influence on their children as well. So just a few decades ago, everyone, including medical science, assumed that nothing was in genes was transmitted across generations. It was absolutely insane, and a lot of people died as a result. But now, as a result of a lot of work on flies and worms and things, we know very well that many things are transmitted across generations, and they can influence health. But also, probably these things play into evolution. That part of it we don't understand yet. There's a lot of theoretical work being done. There's a lot of empirical work being done. It's very, very complicated because we don't have a good way of thinking about it. have a simple kind of model.
Because it's so nested in each other, it's very
A
difficult.
lot of interactions, and a lot of the processes, we don't even know a lot of the mechanisms, we don't understand what the mechanisms are. We know that something's going on, but we don't know.
Yeah, the idea of a question is interesting,
Yeah.
because I've noticed whenever I come up with a question, it's not the question. When I start doing the work, it's just not. It's just a tricky way for my brain to lead me down somewhere to get started. And that's an interesting. That is an interesting thing. I think a difference between with art. You probably have to stay quite tightly focused to checking back. But the question will also change.
Yeah.
The question
Yes.
will also change. But I feel like it's really just.
I changed it, because that question, is that epigenetics? Is that what
Yeah,
we're feeling?
genetics is part of it.
That's an endless question. I don't think that goes away. Always, that's what's going on, because there's always complexity interact.
Yeah, but it's been diminished as a feature. It's been undermined because of the and again, that's the cultural aspect of biology, of science, is that the gene is all important, because it's also easy to study. You just got to get a sequence, you can get lots of papers, just sequence of genes that's important for these things. So it dominated the narrative of science. It's much harder, I would imagine, to be a scientist where you're asking more about the context in which the gene is operating.
No,
or
that
the genetic
challenge
environment.
to the idea about this question changes. I don't think it is done. I'm very interested in what you do, because I think your question always takes you down, well, what are these external influences that are affecting evolution?
Well, it's a very broad
Whereas I
question.
wonder whether does your question remain the same, or does your question change depending on the way that we put?
No, I
big
think
question?
I think the overriding question stays very within a fundamental area.
Certainly collaborative.
Collaboratively it does. And I actually think, I mean, I'm not going to speak for Jane, but I think my overriding curiosity and interests are very much about, where do I fit, and how do I exist in this place, and how do I make sense of it, and how to, just a general idea of my human habitation. So, and it's a very broad question, and I know that, but it's kind of like I guess it's my fundamental question.
I'm very curious, do the questions and the answers, I guess, need to speak to other people, or can they be completely personal and just speak to you? Is it still art?
So, well, certainly we have to have them ourselves. We have to have a reason for making the work. And you asked about that in the other statement. I was just going to say, for me, it does. My question has changed since art school. And it varies with each piece of work. Subtly, it varies with each piece or body of work. It will vary a little bit, the idea or the question. But I just want to backtrack a bit, which I don't know. But just to truth, to say a lot of the work I do is based on science. So I use it as a starting point. And the other thing about truth that I find is very particular to my practice is I will come up with an idea. I don't sort of just go into the studio and think, I'll just do something today. I come up with an idea, and then I'm quite rigorous in my own way of following that idea through to the end.
Where's the end for you?
Well, for example, we're doing work on endangered and vulnerable birds in New South Wales. So I basically got onto the website for the, I can't even think what they're called, but the Department of Environment, and I went through the whole list they've got for vulnerable animals in New South Wales, and I highlighted all the birds, and they cross-referenced them with colonial images, so I sourced the colonial images, and then I'm working with the colonial images in the work. And there's something like 166 images I managed to cross-reference. So in some ways it was a bit frustrating, because I thought, I've got enough birds now, but I just couldn't stop, because I thought that's what keeps me on my tracks, is saying this is my framework, and I'm going to follow it through. It might be truth to other people, but to me, I've followed through that idea.
You've got a mission and an intention and a curiosity, which is very similar to science. Did you do it?
Oh, yeah, that's one.
Yeah,
That's
that's
one.
one. Yeah, that's one.
Do you want to talk about was that the product of your...
Well, I'm working on the bird one now, so there's another one coming. I've been working on a series of wallpapers for a while. So yes, that wallpaper is based on, I've done a series of wallpapers. They're all based on historic wallpapers. So I sourced the original wallpapers through the National Trust or the historic houses, which is called something else now. And so that wallpaper was a wallpaper that was an 1830s wallpaper from Parliament House. So I used the original pattern, I redid it in lantana roots, which I sort of dug up with some help from local regenerators. I whitewashed the lantana roots and then I put them in that pattern. And then all the animals there are vulnerable or endangered, and they're all colonial images, so I've appropriated colonial images of the animals, which is a comment on, it's meant to be a comment on, you know, how we as, I mean, I'm from a white settler background, so it's how we as a colonial country have impacted on the biodiversity, the natural environment. So my question, I guess, would be, how do I as a non-Indigenous person contribute to looking after our biodiversity, our natural world?
So was the original wallpaper?
So the original wallpaper had that basic pattern.
Just the pattern?
Just the pattern. I've only used the pattern and then I've imposed on the pattern.
Lantana pattern?
No.
It's really nice that we see your work.
Yeah.
Because now it puts it into context. So thank you.
Yeah. Basically, I've used an original object, which I tend to do in my work. I find some historic object and then I build onto it and I reinterpret it. And that's, you know, so I could find you the original wallpaper and show you that I've copied the pattern. But it's
I'm just curious about
Yeah.
the form of evolution, how it evolved from what that thing that you saw
Yes.
and what it was that you so beautifully added.
Yeah, well, basically, I guess that's the artistry in it, is you do, like, that's what I'm saying, to me there's a truth often to the way I work, and we nearly always now, but, and then, so I followed that wallpaper, but I spent a long time finding that wallpaper. I looked at a lot of wallpapers, and anyway, I found that one, but they had to be a colonial or early 1800s wallpaper, and then I appropriated the animals. Yeah.
What came first, the idea and then the research on
No,
data?
my idea came first, but the idea actually was about wallpaper. So it was an idea of how can I work with an object that comes from the colonial era, and then I started thinking about what else comes from the colonial era, and I was interested in the early drawings and the paintings that we did of these animals when they were first discovered, and they were so full of love and affection and humour often. And I thought I sort of also had an internal question about how did that translate to what we've done to the environment.
How did you execute that? Is that digital? I can't read. Is it digital?
No, it's not
done or
digital. I've
painted?
hand cut all the animals
Okay.
and then it's laid out like a physical collage. And then
Okay.
I'm going to... Oh, Danny?
Just like an interesting thought that I have had is that when I think something that you think is contrasting between art and science is science. You think you can repeat it, you have the same outcome every time, and with art, you know, it could be different, and maybe you have your process, but like it may end up a little bit different every time, and that's okay. Whereas science, stereotypically, we think otherwise. Although what you were saying before is that because every species is so different, it's actually hard to have that same outcome every single time. And then it's just linking me back to your work, Steve, with the machines, where you try and make the machine draw the same thing every time, and it just won't happen.
It's like, just going to do what he wants to. And then I was just thinking we have such a different way, because I do go into the and just start going. It's just it's also, I mean, vastly interesting the different approaches you can have to it.
Exactly.
And actually, that's overwhelming. Me coming from a science background, the relative safety of the and actually of the material of the laboratory context. I know you go out to the field, but I was not there. There's the centrifuge. There's the microscope. There's the gel apparatus. I know what those things do. I'm going to put something in one of those today. You know, and that's a real safe thing. So that makes me think about what the materials make, because that's the thing about my machines. I think they make me do things. It's not me.
Yes.
They're compelling a behavior in me.
Yeah.
They don't necessarily want anything to do with, but they're going to make me do it anyway. I like a toaster, which is making me just go up and down.
Yeah.
That thing is going to make me put some strange object on top of it for no good reason. And I suppose it's that it's. So here's a thought. So I always think it's really interesting if you take an artist, put them in a laboratory. What are those objects which you know what they do, and I guess I might know what they do, but would you be curious as to know what they do, or would you just want to start playing with it?
Both.
Both. That's a good answer. Politics.
I think that there's a fundamental curiosity in the way, for me anyway, the way things work. It's kind of interesting to know how they work. But then I think it can be fun to upend that, maybe.
And do you think there's a possibility that through upending it, it can learn a new function, this apparatus of yours? It's expensive. Microscope. They can just use as a hammer.
Well, I'm just immediately thought when you take that theme, like a found object or something that artists work with, like yourself, and I also work with found objects sometimes. What you're doing is you're transcribing, you're toning it, you're seeing it for what it is, not for what you know it to be. And so it becomes other than itself. It's like you forget this is chair, and you just see it for its height, its width, its visual nature, the distance it is from you, or how close it is, or what is it hard or soft, all those sorts of things.
So do you think you're changing completely what the object is by changing its context fundamentally?
I think you
At a
can.
philosophical level.
I think it can become metaphor for something else, and I think you can transcribe it. And I've seen artists that do that really well, where you look at something and it's familiar, but you don't know it. You've forgotten it.
Yes.
Or it becomes a visual trigger for something other than what it is.
So as long as it's experimentation.
Yeah, it is experimentation. It's all play.
Take something out of its context, do something
Play?
creative.
Yeah.
And how children play.
Yeah.
Children will take an object that could be the table and it will be turned into something that it's not a table.
Exactly.
Are you calling me a child?
You do Eric
Yeah.
Transforming
Just in terms of play, I was going to ask you a question, Russell, about play and, how much would play be a part of the scientific process?
Yeah, there's a lot of exploration, and
Yeah.
the best kind of science is when it's enjoyable, and it's unexpected things happen, discovery, unexpected discovery. There's a kind of, on the other hand, there's a need to kind of produce things at the end, so that limits the play aspect of it. It needs to be goal-oriented.
Conclusion.
Yeah, it needs to produce research, publish it,
And outcome.
limits the amount of scope of the play.
Because some scientific discoveries happened accidentally, haven't they?
Yeah.
But
I think it's the only way that can happen.
But I just got a question about the evolutionary drive to produce art, because look at my daughters walking around with these incredible dopamine generators in their hands with new content, and yet they both like to draw stuff. And I would have thought that the reward that we get flicking through Instagram or whatever would be harder to break and sit there with a pencil and draw an image that is great, but not probably as good as what they could find on the phone. So, but what's happening there that makes them still want to pick up a pencil and do something that's not as good as what they could see on the phone?
It's a good question.
Because you know it in another way.
There's a concept called
You know it in another way when you try and it's when you can deeply observe something and get past that, get past the idea that you're kind of it's going to be an outcome. Then that would call it the zone sometimes. it's almost meditative because it becomes a completely different experience, and it's like the perfect kind of focus.
Martin Kemp calls it structural intuition. It's
That's
where
a
it's,
nice term.
yeah, I know. I was going to use it tonight in some.
I'm glad you got it in.
It's basically that idea, if you can imagine the cave paintings, it's like, it's a way of controlling and understanding your world. If you can, the miracle of seeing something in the world and then somehow passing it through your brain and into your hand and then seeing it reproduced on the wall, the kind of control that it must give you about, or your idea, or this sense of control you must now have of your world.
But how does that square with the idea that we're
Not control. I
Well,
that's
I think,
the wrong
I,
way,
think,
but-
I think it's more coming to an understanding of this thing. It's an exploration. What is this thing in front of me?
Yeah.
And then when I try and draw it, really hard to draw, by the way.
Really hard to draw. Beautiful drawing.
When you try and draw it, you actually, it's the first time you really look at it. Because when you to really try and render, or it's like the ultimate observation of something, and it's your observation, and there's in a sense it's kind of like finding truth.
But how does that square with the conversation that kids are driven to seek out the highest dopamine reward? And
We all are. It's not just children.
It's a different.
Then is that like what I'm saying is the whole phone thing is dopamine. Is this also dopamine? Or
That's
is
a
it like
different kind.
different permutation of chemical. But again, it's one of those things that I would imagine. It's it's some other kind of stimulation which is fundamentally important to who we are. Paul, did you have a question?
I just, in relation to your one, Lewis talks about it as an intellectual sympathy with the object.
Yes.
So you have this kind of where you become the object. And I think one of the things I'm interested in is that because I don't think you can find truth. You can look for it, and the beauty is in the failure
Kind
of
of
actually
get close
getting
to
there.
it, hopefully.
And the way that science works, it seems to always fail in its thing because it has to fail to try and prove the thing that it needs to prove. And so therefore there's this, if you can enable failure to be a friend, like play, because so many people denigrate play, especially in art schools, to say you shouldn't play because it's an intellectual thing that of course you need to, because you need to play, fail, and then adapt from failure.
I have to.
I have to correct you on that. In art school, I tell my students, and most of us would tell our students, at best it will be a glorious failure.
Yeah, but I think all art is a failure.
But all up, because
it's trying to
actually,
seek truth, when you can't seek
and
it, you
also
can't have it.
if you don't fail, you don't learn anything. You
No.
don't get closer to something. You just stay in this spot, which is not satisfying.
And it's the same with the research question. And the research questions are really bad.
The research question is really bad.
That's when you learn something.
No, because it distracts from play. Because once you define, as the gentleman said, you find the research question, you've actually developed the pathway that you're going to do. And then it's just a matter of procedure and filling that pathway in. And therefore, it asks for the research question almost up front.
Yeah.
And then you're caught in this paradigm of trying to answer that research question. And
Good artists, I guess, will never fall for that. I mean, it'll never couldn't happen. because they'll get tricked. They'll get tricked by their own
Well, I mean,
folly.
everybody has archetypes and preconceptions, and what you were talking about is how do you get rid of some of those archetypes and preconceptions in constructing something about the world that will be rejected by the world. I mean, abstraction has been rejected for a long time.
I was going to pick up on exactly that when you were saying, look at what is the essence of that when you draw it. You know, 6 months ago, I became a grandfather for the first time. And when I observe, it comes to life the idea about representation and presentation. We have a representation because we've been around so long and everything just comes from memory and says, here's the representation of a jug around. But when you observe her, it's all presentation.
Yeah.
It's all presentation. It's all in the moment and present.
Well, that brings up that idea of constructs. Like you know, the idea that everything is a construct, that we've constructed our brains have a way of managing the sensory experience out there. So it's, and science, I guess, is a kind of construct where we had to come up with architecture around how we think about it, and I suppose aren't you trying to deconstruct? Are you trying to not have those constructs, or you have your own?
I think you have the constructs from which you were your whole life experience. So you can't help it because
I think it's also that tension between
detachment, yes.
detachment and attachment.
Yeah.
Because it's how, I know from my art process, when I went to college and my art teacher said, right, let's detach you. We're going to teach you a whole new method, forget what you learned, forget what you know, and then draw. And it's a very different experience. But detachment comes from experience and growth and digging deeper into self to find that detachment. But the exciting part is the attachment and connection when drawing an object and then removing yourself and looking at it. And then maybe drawing it again a week later, you're going to have a different, almost like an experiment. It's what you see and it's going to change.
There's sort of scaffold there around how you detach, which is again a construct. It's a really so that's not escaping that problem. Just giving you another way to try and do that.
Would you escape problems or do you live with problems?
I tend to. Where's the couch? Where is the couch? Am I meant to answer that? No, I don't mind the odd problem. I think they're just they're there, right? You know, I mean, well, I guess so. Listen, I have no idea what the time is.
So 3 more minutes.
Oh, okay.
He asked me.
I just read.
Well, quick question.
Yes, absolutely.
One area that I think kind of sits in the middle is qualitative research, qualitative data. So I'm wondering if you use qualitative data at all in your epigenetics, and do you use it in your art making or in your research around art making, qualitative data?
What do you mean by
What do you
qualitative?
mean?
Yeah.
So quantitative data, how many things?
Yeah.
Qualitative data, what are people's experiences, what are people's knowledge, what's their learned or lived experience, and how do you capture that, and how do you then turn that into something that is scientific and rigorous and able to answer research questions? You don't use it much. You know what I'm talking about.
Well, yeah.
In what I do, we try to measure things and count things as much as we can, but sometimes we can't, and we end up trying to represent things visually as a drawing of a structure of some organism that we work on, or a description of a behavior. But sometimes we can't really quantify, or maybe we've only observed once, so we can just really just describe it. I think that's close to really what we've been talking about.
I don't know that we
How does it influence your work?
Well, I'm sort of sitting in that centre space at the moment, and it's the question, and going back to the research question, is how can art contribute to our ways of understanding ABC, which may be a scientific phenomena or an engineering phenomena. How can art contribute? How can art add value? And so you need to ask people about their experiences, about what they observed, what they felt, so it's sort of, there's autoethnography in there as well. So it's, and with the epigenetics, it's, so, you know, you experienced 9/11, you were pregnant, your baby was born, it's got high cortisol levels. How did you feel during 9/11? What happened during 9/11? So it's the qualitative part of the story.
It's really interesting when art becomes a tool. It's like it becomes something that can be used.
Yeah.
And actually, I remember, Paul, at that conference where you spoke about like where's the undisciplinary, I'll never forget that actually. You use it all the time. You know, because when art is used as a research tool, is there not the danger that it loses what it is?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't see what we do as a research tool. But at best we can get a sense of what the experience is of people that encounter it.
Yeah, because we sort of use ourselves as guinea pigs. So
Yes.
we're the quality research.
Yeah, I mean, because we work on it. It's sort of our experience, which then informs
Yeah.
And then
how
the
we
audience
break it down
or the
and
gallery
break it
visitors would, you know,
Yes.
like with the dyeing that we did, we hung the fabrics and a lot of people would walk through it and go, oh my God, I smell wattle, you know, and you'd say, yes, it's dyed with wattle, you know, or dyed with acacia, or, you know, and kids would go and get into the middle of it and go, Mom, come here, you can smell it. And
That's
that's
it.
that
That's
kind
it.
of conversation.
Yeah.
Because they come from us saying, hey, let's not wash these out, let's not make them fast, let's leave the scent in them, because it's a part of it and it's lovely, and then the people who come to the gallery experience it too. So,
and some people don't, but a lot of people do.
Yeah. And if you set that up as a research piece and collected it systematically and coded it, etc., it would then go into that research science realm as opposed to anecdotes.
Yes,
That's the only thing. It doesn't have to
we didn't
happen
push
like
it to
that.
that degree, but
Doesn't
we'd
have
be
to
happy to, and that partly comes back to finances. Like if someone would give us finances, if we had a grant
Would
to
be
keep
great.
endlessly dyeing plants and testing them and smelling them and so on, and
we
it
have
does
to
need
pay.
to be limited by finances. True. Yeah. Sorry, that's a bit crude to approach on that note, but
No. We probably have to end it. I actually want to congratulate the audience
Thank
because
you. The audience.
I had these questions and they weren't landing, and then the audience just came up with these cracker questions. So thank you for doing my work. And what I think happened here is exactly what I would like to do. It's that there was an encounter of artists and scientists where I think, and what I felt from the room was there was a genuine humaneness, let's call it that, of wanting to know each other. And you were all a big part of that, so I'm thanking you. And also, thank you so much to all three of you for doing this. I really appreciate it. And